Before we allow you to sate your other appetites, we are going to have a bit of Q&A, but I know they want to change the system so we can record some of the Q&A discussions. But while we do that and set that up, any direct questions or clarification to Andrew? Yes, Ian.
It's a two-pronged question. I understand the call, but also listened to Owen this morning, and I think what you're talking about is tracing to an area where Owen was actually talking about tracing to a particular store. So is there sort of a view about actually what do we need to do to trace a CO2 leak to an area or to a store?
I think we've got conflicting requirements there.
No. I don't think we have. I think we've got. I think ours. What we're looking at with our call is part of what Owen's looking for. It's not everything.
Conservation heading.
Yeah.
We're looking at when it's gone wrong, how much is coming out,
Yeah.
and also assuring yourself that towards seabed or Her Majesty's seabed has not been upset, and that the mussels are happy and crabs are still breathing.
Yeah. So I think.
But it is a component. It is a component because then you bring in the deeper focus techniques, which, as you said, are mature, which allow you to pinpoint the source of said food.
I understand that about the call, that yes, there is technology around that will detect a leak and put it to a particular area of the seafloor. What I think you're asking for, though, is chemically fingerprinting that CO2 on the seafloor and saying it is from store A versus store C, though they may be in the same area.
One of my requests, of course, is to be able to real-time detect the PFCs, which appear to be currently on our short list of things that they seem to be the best hand at the moment until somebody comes up with a better tracer. Or I stop the fingerprinting. It would be nice if that could be done downstairs rather than or at subsea rather than taking it back to a lab window. But
Yes. The answer is yes. We're looking primarily at identifying a leak in inverted commas and then being able to say, is it my leak or not my leak? And ideally, at least you'll know where it is. And being able to then say it will link back to whatever.
so as you say, once you found it,
Once you found it and you recognise it's yours, that's when you will throw the book at it, as it were. And it's almost done its job by the time it's done that. Although there's no reason why it can't be used.
But the thing that we've been discussing is the core sampling. How to do effective sampling of gas at the seabed that's 100 or 200 metres down, or in the sediments, and then bring it to the surface and then take it off into a lab, into a spectrometer on the boat.
Well, there are possibilities of doing that on the seafloor.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to broaden this out, because I think we could do with getting onto some of the broader issues. Ian, I think you've probably got the answer you were looking for there. I'm sure there are other questions. I'd love to know how this links to the Oban trial and the Norwegian sediments trial as well. But let's follow those up over lunch. But more specifically, let's try and broaden out this issue and identify what some of the common strands are, what some of the key challenges are. Does anybody want to start us off on where you think those common issues lie on CO2 measurement, MMV, anywhere across the chain of CCS? Yes, yeah, that's right.
I guess there's a difference between detection and quantification. And initially, does the CCS industry and the regulators have a view that detection is okay before, in the early stages of the rollout of CCS in the North Sea? Or are we going to want to be able to quantify any leak on day one of the rollout of CCS in the North Sea?
Okay, a regulator angle on that then, really. Ward, do you have any particular views on that? Sorry, I hadn't realised I was holding the mic there.
Well, the first thing is just a clarification very specifically a question for them. However, I think that it's something that's consistent with what Owen has said. We simply can't try and do everything in the first demonstration projects or early on. So there has to be some sense brought to bear on what it is that we can do. Quantification in some form will need to be there, but I don't think that the levels of accuracy that perhaps are being required from a legal point of view are practical, and therefore I think that the industry, as it moves forward, needs to demonstrate what is a sensible way of implementing the law.
Sarah, do you want to add to that from the DTI? Sorry, DTI. Gosh, I'm going back in history, isn't it? From the deck angle.
Probably the question is along the lines of baseline monitoring to identify what's there in the natural environment, and then moving on towards real-time or real-time monitoring during injection. Whether we need monitoring on day one. Again, it goes back to Owen's point on showstoppers. If there's a potential for a leak pathway that will show up on day 1 or day 30 or day 365 in 1 year, would that be a real prospect to go down the route of a store? So that's something to consider as well.
Paul, are you adding to this comment about cases on regulation?
I wanted to make a point about
Just hold on.
broadly on the regulation. I
You're
think
going to keep Hillary very fit and running around, so you do have to let us sprint 100 yards.
I wanted to, on the regulatory point, I do believe it's kind of the starting point for the discussion, because it's a classic area of information asymmetry for the regulator. The regulators, having been involved in drafting a number of these bits of regulation, is one of the challenges is identifying what the key sources are you can refer to, because, Owen showed us a nice matrix of, these are ones that are doable, these are must do, these are part. Even the regulator is not privy to that knowledge, and therefore needs to understand these limitations in far more detail as to reasons why you pick one technology for this site versus a different one for this site versus a different one for this site, whether it's passive, whether it's active, whether it's frequency of application, and all those factors that build up the cost of different sites. And I think that's the biggest challenge that the regulator faces. And if we think who the competent authority might be for these regulatory approvals, it's a little bit fuzzy in my mind, but I think under the ETS, it will be the, SEPA in Scotland will be responsible for approving a monitoring plan at the early stage, and EA for onshore. Then it's got to go through the Commission permit review as well, for the site permit, which is a slightly different beast. So I think there's a lot of questions here. And what's often happened in the past, we've had to look at guidelines like IPCC, guidelines which have an annex in there with a list of technology options available, and say, okay, the operators should at least consider all of these and say why they're relevant or not. But is that a definitive list? And also brings us to my point about the ETI initiative is why focus in the UK. There's an international need for this type of clear book on what is a definitive list of technologies that a regulator can understand what their role is and how they apply, and that doesn't exist, I don't think.
Well, let's unpick that a little bit. I mean, one thing we can be very pleased about is that the regulatory authorities, the competent authorities in the UK, have been very actively engaged in this discussion from the outset. EA regularly spends at this event as well. SEPA actively engaged, HSE, HSL, the Crown Estate marine authorities have all been actively engaged. So I suppose they have picked up a lot of this knowledge and will not be just blindly setting limits. Is that a fair comment, Paul?
Yes, as I said, we do participate with the regulators, and I think what's very important to recognise in the UK compared to some other countries in Europe and elsewhere around the that the process here is very much one of collaboration and learning, an attempt at transparency. So whether it may be perfect or not is really the point. We have joint meetings with regulators from both England and Scotland and the UK level, all with the focus of attempting to remove barriers. And I think that it's important with these early projects to recognise that process has been already fairly good, and I think that maybe Owen can add more to this. There's a willingness to attempt to collaborate on these sorts of matters and also to be as practical as possible to remove barriers.
So, Owen, and then I think Harsh was wanting to join that issue as well.
I would fully agree. The number of regulators we have had in our virtual reality centre up in Aberdeen, where we have brought out the technical teams, and then the regulators have been able to ask questions. But this will be boards group, EDU, NOs, CCS, have been able to ask us questions about our technologies and why we've chosen things. Similarly, on that collaborative thing, because DEC was funding a lot of stuff in competition with one, everything, all our thought processes are out there on the DEC website and the monitoring technology.
Yeah, but it's one project. I mean, I'm talking about
Yeah.
an EU-wide problem
Yeah.
where you have a project in the Danish sector that has a different set of suite of technologies, perhaps. I know Shell's heavily involved in it too, but I mean, in Italy, for example, that's the point.
Let's broaden the geography a little bit.
And if we
because,
broaden the geography,
Interestingly, this might sound a bit, but the rocks are still rocks. God created the world and define any boundaries. So what I'm applying here, I'm also applying in Australia. Yes, the BGS ETLI report was brilliant and incredibly useful. Anything that's published is scoured by us as well, and generally scoured by other organisations, the GCCSI, and brought up in conferences. So it is all the group learning from one another and trying to apply what's best. What's happening in the Gorgon project in Australia is being absorbed and transferred to Peterhead. So at least within Shell, we're able to transfer around the world, but also the Pittsburgh conference the other day was presented a lot, XPP, the events, etc., GHGT 11.
I think there are a number of technology or knowledge transfer devices that should keep all this reasonably global. For example, the IEA greenhouse gas program have been actively engaged in the Weyburn Mydale project. That information is on, widely available. The Global CCS Institute has got a mandate for sort of coordinating a lot of knowledge transfer and exchange on all these issues, including MNV and CO2 measurement and monitoring. And indeed, the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum has been trying to get initiatives going to build competence and capabilities between nations and to pull with it developing nations that may get left behind in this race.
Yes, I think the key is the risk assessment. It's, you have technologies and you have a risk assessment. I don't care if you haven't sensed or checked every single technology. If you've done your risk assessment and your technologies address those risks along with your mitigations, you have got a fit for purpose solution. It might not be the global minimum, but it is a local minimum and it works. So I think I should say site-specific risk assessment are the key words, not the actual technologies.
Yeah, I think just to clarify the point, last year, for example, the UN process spent 6 months preparing modalities and procedures for CCS inclusion in the CDM. Now, I was heavily involved in that process to the point that the text there does not have a definitive source it can refer to in terms of which monitoring technologies or what is the best practice guide or which technologies do what that can act as a sort of backstop for regulators to look up in. And that was what is needed, because otherwise people say, okay, we use DNV CO2 coastal, we use the GCCSI reference manual, we use the ETI, and we use IPCC, and that's a challenge in itself. It just creates confusion. And I'm not being stupid. I'm just saying what the reality is in terms of actually designing a regulatory
What we'd
framework.
rather see is a globally accepted risk assessment methodology. The technology is subordinate to that. We do not have a global list of how to drill an oil well. We have a risk assessment around how to drill a well safely from what HSE thinks. We don't care whether you use a PDC, better diamond, better rock, better, etc.
I'm going to think that Harsh, who's been desperate to join in this debate for a few minutes now.
Just a short comment. Philip, at the start of today, you said that public acceptance and issues around that are really things that are really priorities for the CCS industry. And I think I'd like to bring in this question of detection versus quantification and link it to that point, because if we end up with a project where we detect a CO2 leak and we announce it because it's material and we don't know how much is leaking, it will be a big challenge for project number 2 to acquire political support and funding. So I think that the question on detection, certainly we need to satisfy regulators, but I think in terms of the bigger picture, if we want subsequent projects to roll out across the world, we will need to think about quantification as well as detection.
Certainly there's a number of stakeholders involved here. Is the publics need to be reassured. That's very different to the regulators in terms of their statutory responsibilities, which is again very different to perhaps those involved in ETS or other sort of fiscal measures. So there's a whole series of debates. Judith?
Sorry, I feel like I'm getting in on this discussion a bit late, but I think the quantification issue, your question, Harsh, is very pertinent, the detection versus quantification. Actually, I'm getting into that a bit in my slides later, but we do have requirements for quantification under the financial aspects of the EU ETS, and actually very important for quantifying exactly how much CO2 has, if any, leaked out, so that, well, firstly, if you get your incentives from your EU ETS from not having to buy allowances, you would need to quantify how much CO2 is actually safely stored. And again, if anything did eventually come out, you would need to quantify that CO2 because you would have to buy allowances on the market and surrender them to account for every single CO2 molecule that came out. So we already have quite stringent requirements in there. And I think the way we sort of present that in the public perception aspect will be quite interesting. And I think, yes, we may need to do more work on quantification, but let's not forget there are requirements in there already which actually put quite a hefty imperative on the developer putting in place quantification technologies, correct?
Okay, now we've limited that discussion. We haven't gone any further than the regulatory issues. I suppose we've touched on a couple of Matthew's point about the accuracy onshore and offshore and how that relates. But there were a whole series of other challenges that the speakers raised this morning. And I'll just sort of put those out there for you to talk about over lunch, and we'll come back on these later. But there were issues of impurities, the multiple source, multiple sink issue, how to do things more cost effectively, the challenge of driving costs down, the large surface areas involved. Ward brought up some of the interaction with wind, the co-location, and things like seabed deformation. Maybe some of the issues between, say, EOR and sources that are being counted in emissions trading schemes, the challenges of access, data acquisition, interference, coexisting rights for different commercial opportunities also came up. We heard from Owen some of the challenges of, we've had some ideas we'll put out there. Can we monitor traces in situ? Can we still measure with the pressure after we've abandoned a well? Is there an efficient way to determine CO2 flux at the seabed? Can we analyse well fluids down the hole with no people involved whatsoever, completely remotely? We heard as well from Tom, some of the issues of the sensitivity and accuracy required in situ sensing, down to 0.03% or even more passive remote sensing, 0.01% accuracy being sought. We also heard there were lots of potential opportunities around acoustics, and we didn't really get into that because Tom's talk was much more about the light what's that word? Optical, that's the word. So a whole series of other issues have been mentioned by speakers. We will try and come back to these later on. We've just focused our initial discussion on perhaps some of the regulatory issues. Do carry on over lunch. I will just encourage you at lunchtime to not only talk to each other about your ideas and how you might collaborate sharing information, looking at some of these bid opportunities, but also have a look at the exhibition, small exhibition area and some of the stands there. Certainly pick up your free copy of the APGTF strategy, which has got lots of bullet points in it, in those horrendous tables relating to MNV and CO2 measurement. And basically enjoy lunch. We'll probably come back slightly, about 1:45.